The Thompson's bursts rattled like walls of lead, shattering every illusion. From San Pietro to the Ardennes, from the burning Rhine to the ruined cities, German soldiers realized too late they could never prevail against America's endless firepower. The war ended, but the echo of the Thompson lingered in the memories of the survivors. December 27, 1943, Hill 730, San Pietro, Italy. In the cramped bunker, the smell of damp earth and gunpowder smoke thickened the air. Hans Keller lifted the steel plate covering the firing slit, letting in a thin strip of grey light. Outside, the village of San Pietro was nothing but rubble now. Shattered roof tiles lay scattered in the mud, walls riddled with holes like torn fabric. Overhead, the winter fog hung heavy, like a mourning shroud. Hans had been here for 3 days. 3 days without a moment's peaceful sleep, his ears straining constantly at the strange sound rising from the valley below. It wasn't like the sporadic crack of a pistol, nor the sharp, screaming bursts of the MP-40. It was faster, steadier, unnervingly regular. The whole bunker knew its name, the one that had spread across the front, the American's typewriter. He opened his notebook and wrote the first line of the day. The Americans fight differently from us. They fire as if ammunition were Walter Schmidt's, his bunker mate, gave a dry chuckle when he glanced at the words. Right, and we're told to treasure every single round. The remark pulled Hans back to the days of training. Ammunition is the lifeblood of the unit. Every shot must have a target. Waste is forbidden, yet here, in San Pietro, all of that seemed meaningless. The Americans didn't just fire to kill one German soldier at a time, they fired as if they meant to erase everything in sight. One burst was enough to turn a shelter into a choking pit of dust and rock. And in those brief seconds when the Germans ducked for cover, the Americans had already crept a few meters closer. That morning, Hans saw more clearly than ever the weight of their firepower. A team of 3 Americans crawled past a collapsed wall, never bothering to aim at anything specific. They simply raised their thick-barreled guns and sprayed the opposite wall. Bricks exploded into dust, and then the team advanced again. No elaborate tactics, no clever maneuvers. Just bullets, so many that it seemed they could fill Hans's bunker in a heartbeat. By midday, the clouds broke a little, a cold light spilling over the wet walls. Hans peered through the slit and spotted a flash of brown uniform behind a broken tree trunk. He drew a breath, squeezed the trigger. The figure dropped. "One down," he muttered, not to boast, but to remind himself he was still alive in this fight. But then the whole bunker shuddered. The opposite wall blew apart in a cloud of white dust. Fire poured in like rain. Sandbags tore open, dirt cascaded down. Hans rolled to the ground, clutching his rifle. Each shot pounded his chest like a hammer blow, turning every breath into a stab. Schmitz shouted over the din, "They're using Thompsons again!" The way he said it, it was as if the enemy wasn't a soldier at all, but the weapon itself. Early in the afternoon, the radio crackled. The sergeant's voice was hoarse. "Hold position until 1900 hours. Then fall back to the second line. Stay away from windows and doors. Fire from holes in the wall. Conserve your ammo." "Conserve," Schmitz sneered, his tone bitter, "while they hose us down like watering a garden." Hans didn't answer. He bent over and scribbled in his notebook. "We conserve ammunition, but the enemy doesn't. That will be the reason for Germany's defeat." By late afternoon, the firing slackened. Hans took the chance to wipe down his weapon. The smell of gun oil steadied him. Then a sharp whistle rang out outside. He rushed to the slit. Through the mist, 3 American figures spread apart like black birds, each carrying a typewriter. They didn't charge head-on. Instead, they advanced while spraying every wall, doorway, and gap in sight. They didn't need to see a German, they just had to be sure no one survived there. Hans pulled back. A young soldier, wounded in the arm, was bleeding dark red. Schmitz fumbled with a bandage. Hans handed him his water flask, then slumped down. He wanted to write again, but his hands trembled. After several minutes of steady breathing, he scrawled, "The sound of the Thompson chills me to the bone." Every burst drives the enemy one step closer. Darkness fell. Rain began to patter on the earth roof above them. In the damp gloom, Hans caught another sound, footsteps different from before. Not the frantic pace of battle, but calm, heavy. They stopped right above the bunker. Clods of dirt dropped onto his shoulder. A voice spoke softly in English. Hans only caught one word. Door. His hand found the last grenade in his pocket. It was cold as stone. He shivered and whispered to himself, "Not yet. I still have bullets." The hatch trembled. A thin beam of light slipped through. Hans pressed his cheek to the rifle stock, sighting on that narrow gap. Outside, a calloused hand was prying up the cover. At that moment, from the right-hand slope, Thompson barked again, 3 short, sharp bursts. Hans held his breath. The entire world shrank to that slit of light, where life and death met in silence. And he knew this was no longer a contest of sharpshooter versus novice. It was a battle between silence and noise, between the old ways and the new age. Outside, a firm voice cut through the rain. Right now, December 27th, 1943. The southern slope of San Pietro. Winter fog clung to the skin like heavy oil, seeping into collars, turning every breath into a plume of cold smoke. Corporal Joe Marlowe slid his boots down the damp hillside, his steel helmet rattling in time with his heartbeat. In his hands, the Thompson M1A1 felt weighty, the dark wood worn smooth with sweat. He ran a palm over the stock, a familiar habit to steady his nerves. To Joe, that gun was more than just a weapon. It was a talisman, the typewriter his buddies spoke of with half-joking, half-fearful voices. Joe's squad was down to 8 men after 3 days of constant fighting. Ahead of them, the village of San Pietro sprawled like a maze built of stone. Brick walls pockmarked with holes, alleys in ruins, a church reduced to a blackened frame. Every corner might hide a German rifleman with a Mauser or an MG-42. Lieutenant Doyle, leading the platoon, clapped Joe on the shoulder before giving the order. "You and Hayes take 3 men and cut through this row of houses. Don't use the front doors. They'll be waiting there to cut you down." Joe nodded, tightening his grip on the Thompson. He'd heard that warning dozens of times. Never step through an intact doorway or window. The Germans were masters at turning entrances into death traps. The American way was different. Blast through walls, break through roofs, then sweep clean. Joe's team closed in on a 2-story house with half its facade torn away. Hayes pulled the pin on a smoke grenade and tossed it through the doorway. A white cloud billowed, cloaking the gap. Joe rushed forward, pressed his back to the wall, then raised the Thompson. He didn't need to aim carefully, just squeeze the trigger. A burst thundered out, making the wall tremble as if struck by a hammer. Brick and plaster flew apart. Joe emptied half the magazine, then crept forward, ready to lose the rest at the faintest sound. Inside were 2 Germans, one already down, the other stumbling back in panic into a side room. Hayes and Kramer stormed in, finishing the fight with short bursts. The strangled cry vanished in the smoke. Joe drew a deep breath, his heartbeat pounding in rhythm with the gun. He'd survived another moment. The battle was nothing like he'd imagined back in Texas. At training camp, they drilled into him, "Keep firing as you advance." The routine exercise, an entire squad stepping forward while pouring out fire, never letting the enemy lift their heads. Only in Italy did Joe grasp the real meaning. Narrow streets, thick stone walls, fortified bunkers, all favoured the defender. The only way to break through was to throw up a wall of bullets thicker than theirs. Joe had seen the MP-40 in action, had heard its chainsaw roar. He had to admit, in sheer fury, it outmatched the Thompson. But what the Thompson had was mobility. Every soldier could become a moving gun nest. When an entire squad opened fire together, the sound merged into a storm. That was how they gained the edge. By noon, the platoon reached a small square, blocked by a half-collapsed stone wall. Doyle signalled them to spread out. Joe crawled along the left flank, Thompson tight against his chest. A German rifle cracked, a round smacking into the wall right beside him. Joe didn't hesitate. He rose and sprayed a burst into the dark window. Plaster burst outward, a faint cry echoing inside. Hayes charged ahead, tossed in a grenade. The blast answered with a dry, hollow thump. When the smoke cleared, the platoon held the courtyard. Joe gasped for breath, noticing his hands trembling with adrenaline. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself. He remembered his father, a World War I veteran, once telling him, "Son, you have to conserve your ammo. The world doesn't make enough for every war." His father's words still echoed, but Joe knew they no longer held true, at least not now. The factories across the Atlantic ran day and night, shipping endless crates of 45 rounds. To Joe, every magazine was a slice of his life, and it wasn't going to run out here. By late afternoon, drizzle fell. Joe's squad was ordered to push up against the German bunkers on the ridge. The slope was slick with mud and loose stones, every step treacherous. Joe crawled low, hearing the Germans return fire, sporadic, single shots, carefully measured. He realized they were conserving ammunition. Meanwhile, his squad fired short bursts, leapfrogging one another uphill. Every 10 steps, another magazine ran dry. Invisible walls of bullets pressed the enemy back into their holes. Near the bunker's mouth, Joe signalled to Kramer. They split, flanking both sides. Joe hurled a grenade, then rushed in, gun at his hip. The Thompson roared, its muzzle spitting orange flame into the twilight. Each shot slammed down like a hammer. Dust filled the air, blinding him. When it cleared, 2 Germans lay still. Joe dropped onto the dirt, heart hammering wildly. He knew he'd just slipped past the scythe of death. From his pocket, he pulled a small photograph, his kid sister standing in front of the family store back home. He stared at it for a moment, then tucked it away again. It was his reminder he had to live, not just for himself. As night fell, the platoon lit fires inside the ruins of a collapsed courtyard. Joe cleaned his weapon, slid in fresh magazines. The Thompson was caked in mud, reeking of powder, but it had saved him twice that day. He rubbed the wooden stock gently, whispering, "As long as you're alive, I'm alive." Far off in the darkness, he caught the sounds from the enemy's bunkers, shovels scraping earth, clipped commands. Then, from the left flank, another unit's Thompsons barked, 3 short, sharp bursts. Joe managed a weary smile. It was a sign that the enemy wouldn't sleep easily tonight. He leaned back against a sandbag, eyelids heavy. Before drifting into restless slumber, he thought, maybe some German soldier out there was scribbling in his journal right now that we fire too much, waste too much. But it was that very waste that was winning this war. The night at San Pietro thickened, filled only with the patter of rain, the weary breathing of soldiers, and somewhere out there in the dark, the familiar rhythm of tat-tat-tat, the heartbeat of the entire US Army. December 28, 1943. Field headquarters of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, behind the Gustav Line. In the old stone house that had been turned into a command post, cigarette smoke mixed with the damp chill of winter. A map lay spread across the wooden table, studded with small red and blue flags. Lieutenant Otto Weiss, a young staff officer, bent over, tracing the symbols with a ruler. Each red flag marked one of their squads still holding out. Each blue flag marked the ground the Americans had just taken. And with every passing hour, the blue spread a little further. Otto was no soldier by blood. He had been a math teacher in Berlin. Since 1939, he had been assigned to staff duty to do what he did best: calculate. Ammunition consumption, how many days a unit could hold out, casualty rates by terrain. Everything came down to formulas. He trusted formulas, believing that with enough data the results could never be wrong. But the reports pouring in from San Pietro had reduced his formulas to nonsense. That morning, the field phone rang. A communications sergeant handed him a dispatch. Otto scanned it, his brow furrowing. Unit lost contact after 17 minutes of engagement. Enemy firepower was extremely heavy, estimated 2 men to every machine gun. Our troops unable to hold defensive positions longer than 10 minutes. He set the paper down, muttering under his breath. 2 men to a machine gun? Impossible. Major Schwartz, the operations chief, drew long on his cigarette and let out a thin stream of smoke, smirking. The Americans fight wastefully. Let's see how long they can keep it up. We have experience. They're just leaning on their piles of ammunition. Otto stayed silent, but his mind flashed back to the year before. In Tunisia, he had once read a report from an officer at Kasserine, an unprecedented level of automatic fire. No distinction between machine gunners and ordinary riflemen. It seemed as though anyone could fire full auto. At the time, the higher-ups dismissed it. Those men are exaggerating to cover their defeat. Now, in Italy, Otto was watching the so-called exaggeration unfold in real life. At midday, Otto went with 2 aides to the supply depot. The battalion's ammunition stores were down to less than a third of their initial allotment. Each rifleman was issued 60 rounds. Most had already burned through half. The old quartermaster grumbled, "If there's no resupply tonight, there'll be nothing left to hand out by morning." Every shot fired was like a cut straight to the heart. Otto jotted notes, his chest heavy. He pictured the Americans, never needing to count each round. They'd empty a whole magazine just to suppress a shadow behind a wall. The contrast was like a knife in the pride of the German army. Back at headquarters, he reopened an old file. Reports from the 1920s, when Germany had first studied the Thompson. The notes were plain. Overly complex, too costly, suitable only for police or gangs. No nation could afford to issue it widely to infantry. Otto sat motionless for minutes. Those papers were the root of it all, a flawed conclusion hardened into doctrine for 2 decades, and now soldiers were paying the price. That afternoon, casualty reports came in. The battalion at San Pietro had lost more than 200 men in just 6 days. Otto read through the roster of units erased from the rolls. Names tied to friends from training days were now nothing but red slashes. He folded the list quietly and slipped it into his breast pocket, but his heart felt frozen. Schwartz spoke again. "Trust the High Command. The Americans will run out of ammunition soon enough. Then one of our marksmen will stop 10 of them." Otto wanted to argue. He pictured the Americans advancing while firing, step by step. In his mind, he built an equation. 10 precise rifle shots against 100 rounds of automatic fire. The outcome was obvious, but saying it aloud, he feared, would break what morale remained. That evening, wind howled through the broken window panes. Otto sat by the oil lamp, drafting his report for higher command. His hand trembled slightly, yet he wrote, "The enemy employs automatic fire as a primary weapon, no longer as support. Flexible deployment, appearing at any position. Our current doctrine does not account for this. Recommend reconsidering the distribution of machine guns within the squad." He set down the pen and sighed. Writing it was easy. Changing doctrine etched deep over years. Impossible. He lifted the cold coffee cup, swallowed the bitter dregs, and whispered, Berlin was wrong, and we are dying for that mistake. At midnight, American artillery began to thunder again. The earth shook like an earthquake. Amid the explosions, Otto still caught that distinctive sound, tat-tat-tat, carrying through the night. It was like the heartbeat of some colossal beast, steady, relentless, unending. Otto clutched the notebook in his hands. For the first time, his fear came not from the shells, but from the realization that formulas, calculations, and all the beliefs he had clung to were nothing but scraps of paper against the industrial tide rolling in from across the ocean. And he knew, tomorrow, on the map, the blue would spread over a few more squares. January 1944. Monte Cassino, Italy. At dawn, the valley lay beneath a shroud of fog as heavy as a burial cloth. Above, the ancient abbey loomed, its grandeur reduced to cracked stone, each wall a fortress, every chamber a gun nest. The Germans called it Festung Casino, Fortress Casino. To the Americans, it was simply a maze to be cleared, brick by brick. Hans Keller was ordered to hold the ruined house along the road leading up to the abbey. He and 6 others had turned the ground floor into a bunker. Sandbags piled high, firing slits carved into the walls, an MP-40 set on a cracked brick ledge. Everything was by the book. Overlapping fields of fire, every doorway and window covered. He scribbled a quick note in his journal. If they come through the door, we can hold. If they come through the window, we can still hold. But if they come through the wall... He broke off mid-sentence, lifting his head. The air was stretched taut as a wire. Somewhere down in the valley, American guns began to rumble. And then it came again. The familiar sound, deep and heavy. Tut-tut-tut. Hans looked at Schmitz, crouched behind the MP-40. Neither man spoke. They both knew a storm of death was on its way. Below, Corporal Joe Marlowe drew in a breath of dust-thickened air. His platoon pressed up to the edge of the village. The officer gave the order, no doors. Through the walls, Joe nodded. He knew this drill by heart. He rushed up to the outer wall of the house, raising his Thompson. The wooden stock bit into his shoulder as he lost half a magazine. Bricks shattered, plaster exploded into chalky clouds. The 45 rounds hammered the wall like fists on a hollow drum. When the gap was wide enough, Joe kicked hard, bursting through with muzzle fire blazing. He wasn't aiming at any single figure. He was firing into space, into every shadow that might conceal an enemy. Inside, Hans flinched. A brick burst apart inches from his head, dust stinging his eyes. No one appeared at the door, but suddenly the entire wall was turning into a honeycomb. "They're breaking through the wall," Hans shouted. Schmitz swung the MP-40 toward the front entrance, ready to unleash a burst. But it was pointless. The enemy wasn't coming through the door, they were tearing in from the flank. The tat-tat-tat merged with the sound of cracking masonry, echoing like the abbey's ancient bells turned to war drums. What had seemed like a bulwark was crumbling away piece by piece. Hans hurled a grenade through the fresh gap. The blast thundered back at him, but a burst of Thompson fire answered immediately. Bullets ripped across the earthen wall, splintering wood. Schmitz crumpled, his hands still locked on the trigger. Hans froze, heart hammering. He forced his rifle to his shoulder, squeezed off a few shots, but the typewriter drowned them out completely. The smoke hadn't yet cleared when Joe burst through the wall. In the dim light, he caught sight of the German slumping over the MP-40, already down. Another soldier, face smeared with dust, eyes red and wild, raised his rifle at him. Joe pulled the trigger, Thompson roared, and the man pitched forward into the rubble. Joe could no longer tell if the pounding in his chest was his own heartbeat or the rhythm of the gun. He shouted, part to smother his fear, part to rally his squad. "Move up! Get in!" Hayes and Kramer stormed behind him, their bursts scouring the corners. The bunker was taken in less than a minute. Hans slumped against the blood-stained wall, vision swimming. In the haze, he saw an American standing at the doorway, weapon in hand, strange, brutal, inexhaustible. The man advanced while firing, as if his supply of bullets would never end. Hans reached weakly for his last grenade, but his arm was too heavy. The small journal in his breast pocket pressed against his chest. His thought came in fragments. If someone finds this notebook, read it. To understand why we lost Joe scanned the wrecked room. Rubble, sandbags, German bodies sprawled. A suffocating silence hung there, broken only by water dripping from the shattered roof. He knew the fight wasn't over. Across the street, there were dozens more bunkers like this one, each another wall to break through. He wiped sweat from his brow and slapped in a fresh magazine. Before leaving, his eyes caught on something small beside a fallen German, a blood-stained notebook, words scrawled across its pages. There was no time to read. He left it where it lay and plunged back into the casino labyrinth. That day, the ancient walls of Casino ceased to be strongholds. They became silent witnesses, recording how war itself had changed. And when they crumbled beneath the rain of Thompson fire, they whispered the answer. Germany's supremacy was nearing its end. February 1944. The Anzio beachhead, Italy. Night fell with a salty chill drifting in from the sea. A misting rain settled over damp sand, mingling with the acrid smell of fuel from ships that had just pulled back offshore. Far away, the flashes of Allied naval guns lit the horizon, then faded, leaving behind an ominous silence. On the beach, thousands of American and British troops dug foxholes, bracing for what everyone knew was coming. The German counterattack. Lucia Bianchi, an Italian girl barely in her 20s, huddled inside a half-ruined brick house near the shore. She had once been a trainee nurse at the local hospital, but the war had swept her into its tide. The hospital was flattened by bombs, and she had drifted to Anzio, where the British had put her to work in a field aid station. Tonight, while running to fetch medicine, she'd stumbled into the fighting. Now she was trapped in a collapsed cellar with 2 wounded men, one American, one German. The American, barely more than a boy, groaned softly, shrapnel having torn across his shoulder. The German, middle-aged, was bleeding heavily from his thigh, but his eyes stayed sharp with suspicion, his hand clenched around a dagger. Lucia knelt, medical bag beside her, and said firmly, "If you both want to live, let me bandage you. If you fight each other, you'll both die here." They said nothing. Only the distant rumble of guns answered, and then that familiar sound on the street outside, tat-tat-tat, sheets of lead ripping the night apart. At the defensive line, Hans Keller, who had escaped Casino by feigning death, was now with a unit blocking the beachhead. He still carried his notebook, though every page he wrote only deepened his despair. His platoon had orders to assault a row of houses where American positions had been reported. Hans crawled forward in the rain, every step like dragging stone. "Remember, conserve your ammo," the sergeant whispered, the same hopeless refrain. Hans let out a dry, bitter laugh. In his mind, he still heard the typewriter's endless chatter, the enemy that never tired. Across the lines, Corporal Joe Marlowe had no chance of sleep either. His platoon was ordered to hold the row of houses near the Mussolini Canal. Sandbags stacked at the doors, Thompsons posted in every corner. Joe slapped in a fresh magazine, mud streaking his hand. He knew the night would be brutal. The Germans would throw everything they had at the bridgehead. Near midnight, sounds rose on the street, hobnailed boots grinding stone, low guttural whispers. Doyle murmured, "Get ready." Then, from the dark, fire erupted. An MP-42 roared. Instantly, a chorus of Thompsons answered, layered, relentless, crashing like waves against cliffs. Joe fired short bursts, sweeping the muzzle across the windows. In the cellar, Lucia clamped her hands over her ears, trying to shut it out. but no one could block out such fury. The house shook, bricks rattling loose. The German soldier gritted his teeth, trying to rise. The young American cried out, reaching for the pistol he'd dropped. Lucia shouted, her voice breaking, "Enough! You're both bleeding out. If you fight, neither of you will live." But outside, the gunfire mocked her words. The Thompsons' beat hammered on, sealing everyone inside the dark. Hans and his squad pressed close to their target house. They had only advanced a few meters when a sudden flash lit the windows. Thompson fire lashed out. The first 3 men fell instantly. Hans hit the mud, heart pounding. He saw it clearly. Their MG-42 carved single deadly lines, but fixed in place. The enemy's Thompsons were everywhere, windows, walls, even through the shattered roof. Inside, Joe shouted, "Keep the rhythm! Switch positions! Don't let 'em pin us down!" He and his men moved constantly, darting from room to room, firing as they went. Each man became a fragment of the storm scattered through the building. The Germans could not pinpoint where the real gun nests were. In the cellar, Lucia pulled the 2 wounded men flat to the floor as the walls trembled. She could hear the rhythm of the guns outside, like a colossal drum beat, drowning even the sound of her own heart. She thought, the sound of war is so soulless, so monstrous, not only men screaming, but steel itself shrieking. A German grenade clattered inside. Joe kicked it back out. The explosion ripped the doorway down, choking the room with dust. In the chaos, Joe rolled into the next chamber and stumbled on a sight he hadn't expected. A young woman crouched in a side cellar with 2 wounded soldiers. Startled, his Thompson instinctively levelled. Lucia screamed, "Don't! They're both wounded!" Joe froze. His finger tightened, but he met her eyes. For a split second, the gun that should have fired stayed silent. He lowered it. He shouted back to Doyle, "Civilians in here!" On the other side, Hans had reached the house. He glimpsed an American soldier at the cellar entrance, weapon raised. Instinct screamed to fire. But in the glow of shattered light, he caught sight of a white figure, the young woman with arms spread, shielding the wounded. In that instant, Hans lowered his rifle. The shot died in the chamber. The German counterattack was broken after just over an hour. The streets lay littered with bodies. Joe sagged against the wall, his shoulder raw from the Thompson's recoil. He watched the enemy pull back. In the side cellar, Lucia's hands still shook as she bandaged both men, American and German alike. Joe gave her a silent nod, then turned back to his post. Hans, retreating with the battered survivors, felt his pulse still racing. He wasn't sure why he hadn't pulled the trigger when he saw the girl. But he knew this. In the storm of bullets and blood, a single human gaze could make a man falter. The night at Anzio ended in heavy silence. Yet in the memory of everyone there, it echoed like a vast drum line, Thompsons pounding, MG-42s growling, human hearts racing in terror. And within that clash of iron rhythms, another beat still endured, the fragile heartbeat of compassion. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. Dawn broke over a lead-grey sea, waves churning restlessly. Layer after layer of landing craft rose and fell in the surf, pitching through a storm of shellfire. The shore ahead was no gentle strand of sand, but a wall of steel, spitting down torrents of fire. Machine gun rounds shredded the surf, mortars tore the wet sand apart. Overhead, dark clouds split open with the flashes of 1,000 gun barrels. Inside one Higgins boat racing toward shore, Corporal Joe Marlowe clutched his Thompson, his hands slick with a mix of seawater and sweat and the blood of the man who had collapsed beside him. Each passing second stretched into what felt like a century. 30 seconds, the officer bellowed, his voice straining over the storm of fire. Joe drew a long breath, whispering to himself, The gates of hell are opening. High above, in a concrete bunker, German Corporal Heinrich Vogel, known to his comrades as the Beast of Omaha, pressed the trigger of his MG-42. He had been firing since before dawn, spent shell belts snaking around him like coils of steel. Below, waves of boats kept driving in. Vogel clenched his teeth, unleashing burst after burst. The chainsaw growl of the MG-42 drowned out the roar of sea and wind. His hands never trembled. Yet the longer he fired, the clearer it became. The enemy was endless. One line fell, another pressed forward. A grey tide that knew no fatigue. The ramp of Joe's Higgins boat dropped. Instantly, a burst tore across it. The man in front of him fell, blood spilling into the seawater. Joe plunged over the side, the cold slashing into his skin. He waded into the storm of bullets, each step a march into death itself. His body felt like lead, but he held the Thompson high against his chest. Bullets hissed past his ears, sand erupted in clouds. The stench of powder, blood and salt water mingled in the air, so thick it made him want to vomit. At the waterline, Joe dove behind a mound of sand. His heart thundered, his ears rang. Around him lay dozens of bodies, waves rolling in and out, dragging away helmets, shattered rifles, even severed limbs. A sergeant crawled up, shouting, "Marlowe! Your team with me. We're clearing that bunker on the right." Joe nodded, slamming in a fresh magazine. He moved with a kind of automatic speed, as if instinct itself had taken command. Inside the bunker, Vogel kept firing. The MG-42 howled, but the barrel glowed red-hot, his hands blistered. Acrid smoke filled the room, the iron stench of scorched steel choking the air. Then from the bunker's flank, Vogel caught a different sound. Tat, tat, tat. Not heavy fire, not rifles. The chatter of men closing in. He cursed. He knew then the enemy had broken through the beach line. Here, the MG-42 no longer held the advantage. Joe led a three-man team around a block of stone. The MG still chewed the sand in front, but they didn't rush head-on. They slithered along a drainage ditch, crawling like eels. At the bunker wall, Joe raised a hand. He inhaled deep, then sprang up. The Thompson thundered, spewing rounds into the firing slit. The 45 slugs smashed into concrete, spraying white dust. Hayes hurled a grenade through the opening. The blast rocked the bunker, choking it with smoke. Joe hugged the wall, finger tight on the trigger, sweeping the doorway with fire. He didn't wait for a figure to appear. He poured bullets into the shadows. Rounds ricocheted, echoes booming like war drums, drowning out the MG's growl. Inside, Vogel gagged on smoke, his ears ringing. One comrade was already down. He swung the MG, but the haze blinded him. Through the slit, he glimpsed an American rushing in, that heavy-barreled gun raised. In a fleeting instant, Vogel's eyes met Joe's through the smoke. One was the spent defender, hands blackened by powder. The other, the assault trooper, his weapon roaring like thunder. Joe emptied the magazine, sparks flaring inside the bunker. Vogel reeled backward, the MG falling from his grip. The chainsaw's scream was cut off mid-growl. The bunker was theirs. Joe slumped onto the wet sand floor, gasping. He rammed in another magazine, his hands trembling so hard he bit down on his lip to steady them. Behind him, his squad swept in, finishing the fight. Outside, the beach lay shattered by fire. The sand was no longer pale, but dark with blood. The tide surged up, washing crimson into pink streaks, carrying back into the sea the cost of every yard gained. Joe stared out across the beach, dimly aware he was witnessing a new chapter in the war. He stroked the Thompson's stock and whispered, "As long as you live, I live." The guns still thundered, but in Joe's mind, Omaha Beach had already changed colour. The grey of steel, the red of blood, and the souls crushed between two storms of fire. November 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, German-Belgian border. A heavy fog coiled around the dark fir trees, cloaking every path. Wind hissed through the canopy, whispering like ghosts. The forest floor was a mire of mud, mines, and barbed wire. No sunlight pierced the gloom, only the damp stench of mould, blood, and gun smoke lingered. Corporal Joe Marlowe trudged through rotting leaves, boots weighed down by mud. His Thompson sagged against his shoulder, at once a companion and a burden. He had fought through Omaha, had seen the shoreline turn to blood. But Hürtgen was different. Here there was no sea, no shore, only forest, its looming trees like spectres ready to swallow anyone who entered. Across the lines, Corporal Hans Keller was back in action after Cassino and Anzio. This time he had been assigned to a Volksgrenadier unit, made up mostly of boys not yet 18 and veterans already spent. Hans carried his Kar 98K with so few cartridges that each was counted like gold. He watched the pale faces of the boys, cloaks hanging loose, hands trembling on their rifles. They called him the Old Man, though he was only 25. Hans only gave a weary smile. On the other side, Joe and his squad halted at a small clearing. It looked safe until a young soldier stepped out and a mine erupted. The scream was cut short, blood and dirt flying skyward. The unit flattened themselves to the ground, hearts racing. "Don't stop moving," Sergeant Doyle roared. "This forest won't let us stand still." Joe crawled low, weapon pressed close. Every tree could conceal a sniper, every thicket could hide a mine. Hans and his comrades lay in ambush along a trail. They rigged grenades on branches tied to thin wires. When the Americans touched them, the grenades dropped, detonating with brutal cracks. Shouts echoed through the mist, then fell silent. Hans fired his Kar 98K. A shadowed figure collapsed. He slid the spent casing into his pocket. 1 round, 11 left. With every shot, he forced himself to count so he wouldn't lose track. On the American side, Joe heard the stutter of gunfire ahead. Tat, tat, tat. His countrymen firing back, Thompsons chattering into the fog. The 45 slugs shredded leaves, splintered trunks into white bursts. The forest shook as if hammered by mallets. Joe and Hayes advanced, shoulder to shoulder, firing and shouting. They couldn't see the enemy, only blaze into the darkness. For those few seconds, the gunfire itself was the only shield keeping death at bay. Hans retreated through brambles, heart racing. American bullets tore across, foliage flying apart. A boy beside him dropped, eyes staring wide, forever frozen. Hans bit down hard, tried to drag the body back, but his hands, slick with blood, slipped away. He hurled a steel hand granite. The blast reverberated, but almost instantly the Thompsons answered, denser, fiercer. Hans hissed under his breath. "Do they never run out of bullets?" When night fell, the Hürtgen forest became a mass grave. Screams and explosions rang from all directions, but no one could truly see the enemy. Joe crouched in a shallow foxhole, cloak soaked through. He wiped down his Thompson, hands trembling from the cold. Not far away, Hans scratched another line in his battered notebook. "Tonight this forest devoured all men. It swallowed every sound, leaving only the roar of American guns. At dawn, the fog lifted just enough to reveal bodies strewn across the damp earth. Hundreds gone, from both sides, for only a few hundred yards of ground." Joe dragged himself past fallen comrades, his chest heavy. Hans quietly pulled a blanket over the youngest boy in his squad, the face still marked by youth. They never saw one another, but both men knew the same truth. The Hürtgen forest took no sides. It would consume anyone who dared step inside. December 1944. The Ardennes. The sky hung heavy with leaden clouds, the wind cut like knives, snow blanketed every house and forest. The air was so still that many American soldiers believed this might be the rare Christmas without gunfire. But at dawn, on December 16th, the horizon shook with German artillery. Thousands of shells rained down, snow churned into red mud, and from the shadow of the trees, columns of tanks and infantry surged forward. The Battle of the Bulge, the last gamble of Hitler, had begun. Corporal Joe Marlowe of the 101st Airborne Division was dug in at Bastogne. He had never known cold like this. Fingers numb, hands cracked and raw, every touch of the Thompson's steel felt like a frost burn. Yet Joe never let go. The gun was the only warmth he had left. His squad was trapped in the encirclement. German shells fell ceaselessly, rations dwindled, their thin overcoats no shield against the killing chill. Joe looked at his comrades, many shivering, lips purple. And he understood. Death here came not only from bullets, but from the invisible cold squeezing the life out of their hearts. Sergeant Doyle warned them. "We can't pull back. Bastogne has to hold. Take good care of that Thompson of yours." Joe nodded, clutching the weapon. It had carried him through the long war, and it would carry him still. Across the lines, Corporal Hans Keller marched with a Panzer Grenadier unit, thrown into the campaign with promises, "This will be the blow that finishes the Americans." He wore a white cloak, a Kar 98K slung on his back, an old MP-40 clutched in his hands. But wading through knee-deep snow, Hans knew the slogans from far-off Berlin gave no warmth to frozen feet. Inside, he understood this was a desperate gamble. Shells they still had, men they still had, but supplies were as fragile as thin ice. The boys beside him, not yet 20, marched with bright eyes, believing in the miracle of the Ardennes. Hans looked at them and quietly wrote in his notebook, "We carry the dream of victory, but in the snow I smell only blood about to be spilled." Day 3 of the siege. Bastogne lay buried in ice. Joe and his squad were ordered to hold a small village at the forest's edge. They dug trenches in the snow, turning each house into a gun nest. That afternoon, from the white haze, German figures in winter cloaks appeared. Hans was among them, crawling forward through the drifts. Suddenly the village erupted in gunfire. The MG-42s roared, but were smothered almost at once by the thunder of Thompsons from windows and dugouts. Joe fired short bursts, his stiff fingers barely squeezing the trigger. The 45 rounds tore through smoke and snow, sending up sprays of white dust flecked with red. He shouted, "Keep the rhythm! Don't let them close!" Hans flattened himself, snow biting into his face. A Thompson burst swept just overhead, splintering a tree trunk beside him. He raised his MP-40, firing back, but the few scattered rounds vanished against the wall of lead. At this range, those typewriters turned the village into a meat grinder. The assault dragged on for hours. Night fell, lit only by muzzle flashes and the sickly glow of flares. Joe lay in his foxhole, chest burning with cold and exhaustion. He checked his ammo, enough for one more burst. Yet he didn't feel despair. The Thompson in his hands seemed to breathe, alive, promising to guard him for another day. Hans, retreating with the handful who survived, slumped beneath a tree, his hands so numb he could not unlace his gloves. He pulled out his pocket notebook, its pages blurred by damp. With shaking letters he wrote, "The enemy's firepower is overwhelming. And the cold, both drink our blood." On December 26th, American reinforcements broke through to Bastogne. Joe watched the Sherman tanks rumble in, relief loosening his chest. They had survived the frozen hell. Yet when he stepped outside, he saw the long rows of comrades' bodies beneath the snow, graves without markers. Hans, too, was ordered to pull back. His unit was reduced to barely a third of its strength. He trudged out of the Ardennes, leaving behind a shattered dream. In his ears the sound lingered, the chatter of Thompsons echoing from the villages they abandoned, a sound etched deeper than even the cold. March 1945. West bank of the Rhine, Remagen. The river ran swift, the afternoon light breaking into 1,000 shards of silver steel. On the western bank, thousands of American soldiers formed up, engineers laying pontoons, artillery lining up their barrels toward the east. Across the river lay the heart of Germany, the core of a collapsing Reich. Joe Marlowe sat in a makeshift dugout, cleaning his Thompson. He knew that tomorrow they would cross this river, moving one step closer to victory. On the far bank, Corporal Hans Keller stood with the remnants of a Volksturm unit dug in around the Ludendorff Bridge. They were a ragged mix, 16-year-old boys who didn't yet know how to shave, stooped old men who had spent their lives in the mines, and a few exhausted veterans. Hans clutched his battered Kar 98K. Only 2 clips of ammunition remained. Orders echoed from above. The Rhine must be held at all costs. If it falls, Germany ends, Hans thought quietly. We've been finished for a long time. Berlin just refuses to see it. March 7th. The sky was a dull grey, wind cutting sharp. American artillery thundered onto the east bank. Earth and stone erupted, the Ludendorff Bridge shuddered under the blasts. Joe and his squad scrambled into assault boats, the river spray slapping their faces. Every second was a death sentence. German machine guns tore at the water, bullets ploughing furrows through the current. Joe braced his Thompson, firing as he shouted over the roar of the river, "Return fire! Cover the engineers!" His gun hammered into the spray, streams of 45 rounds forming a wall of lead before the boat. The Rhine foamed white, as if the river itself were aflame. Hans lay in a shallow pit along the bank, rifle pressed hard to his shoulder. He watched the American boats surge forward, spitting fire like dragon's breath. The young soldier beside him crumpled after the first volley, his blood mixing with the rain. Hans clenched his teeth and fired, one shot, then another, but the river was choked with enemy men. Through the haze, the truth hit him. He was firing into a tide of humanity that never ran dry. For every man who fell, 3 more rose in his place. And at the front there were those thick-barreled guns spraying ceaseless bursts. Tat, 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 a sound that cut through even the rolling thunder of the big guns. Joe leapt from the boat, charging up the bank. His Thompson barked, bullets smashing into brush, rocks, trenches. Behind him, engineers hauled timbers, laying pontoons. Inch by inch they carved out a foothold. He spotted a German rising behind a mound of earth, a hollow face, weary eyes, a rifle raised. In that instant, Joe squeezed the trigger. His burst swept across, the man crumpled, clutching a tattered flag as he fell. Joe didn't pause. He surged forward, voice hoarse, screaming, "Cross! Keep crossing!" By late afternoon, the Americans held the bridgehead. The Ludendorff Bridge shook under bombs and shells, but stood fast, as if by miracle. Wave after wave of GIs poured across, turning the Rhine, the pride of Germany, into a highway for invasion. Hans lay wounded, blood soaking into the snow. He slumped by the riverbank, vision dimming, yet the sound was clear. The steady beat of American guns, drowning out all else. In his final breath, he whispered, "Berlin was wrong. We've lost this war." Joe stood upon the bridge, staring down at the Rhine stained red. The waters foamed, flames of artillery dancing on the current, as if the river itself were on fire. He gripped his Thompson, sweat and rain running together. He knew this was more than a victory. This was the end of the enemy. Joe lifted his eyes to the heavy grey sky and whispered, "Tomorrow we march on Berlin." April 1945. Berlin. Grey clouds hung low, flames rising from rooftops, staining the sky with a sickly red glow. Streets lay buried in rubble, Sherman tanks thundered forward, squads of American infantry close behind, rifles at the ready. Every step struck like a hammer blow on the exhausted heart of Germany. Joe Marlowe marched with the column, his Thompson heavy on his shoulder. He had lost count of how many battles he had survived, how many comrades had fallen. By now, whenever shots rang out, his finger squeezed the trigger on reflex. But today, walking through a dying city, Joe felt something different. The war was almost over. Deep underground in an old cellar, Hans Keller lay curled in a corner, his body wrapped in makeshift bandages. His unit was gone. Only a few broken remnants remained. The 16-year-old boys had thrown down their rifles and fled. The old militiaman had collapsed from exhaustion. Hans was the last, clutching his rain-soaked notebook with trembling hands. He wrote, "No army left. No supplies. Only illusions. What are we fighting for now?" The rumble from above grew louder. Hans knew the Americans were coming. Joe led his squad deeper into the city. They stopped at a narrow alley where scattered German shots cracked out. Doyle signalled, "Sweep it." Joe surged forward, Thompson roaring, bullets tearing across brick walls. Dust and shards flew, smoke filled the air. When the shooting stopped, silence fell, broken only by the crackle of flames. Joe stepped through and saw a figure slumped against the wall, a young German soldier, rifle still slung on its strap. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, but his breath had already stilled. Joe bent down, pulled a blanket over him, then moved on quietly. His chest felt heavy. They were no longer enemies, just children shoved into death. In the cellar, Hans heard the Americans calling to one another, boots striking closer. He tried to stand, but his body failed him. He opened his notebook, reaching for one last line, but the pen slipped from his grasp. The book tumbled to the floor, falling open to a blank page. The door crashed open. An American appeared, weapon raised. Hans had no strength left to resist. He looked up, eyes calm in surrender. Joe entered the cellar. Thompson aimed. In the dim light, he saw a thin, blood-stained German, eyes hollow and vacant. The man did not lift a weapon, only sat slumped against the wall, hands limp at his sides. At his feet lay a notebook filled with scrawled lines. For a moment, Joe and Hans looked at each other. There was no hatred left, only the exhaustion of two men ground to pieces by war's machine. Joe lowered his gun. He signalled for a medic. Hans sagged to the side, lips moving but no sound coming. Joe picked up the notebook and tucked it into his jacket. On May 8th, the war in Europe ended. Joe stood among cheering American soldiers, but his heart felt no joy. He remembered the eyes of the man in the dark cellar. He remembered the blood-red beach, the death-haunted forest, the frozen Ardennes, and the burning river at Remagen. This victory, he thought, was built on mountains of corpses, on the endless rattle of guns. Joe opened the battered notebook, flipping through the uneven German script. He could not understand all the words, but he knew one thing. The man who wrote them had lived the same nightmare he had. He whispered softly, "In the end, we all lost this war." Germany fell silent. The city still burned, but the guns were gone. The ruined houses stood like gravestones for an entire generation. Joe set down his Thompson, no longer carrying it as part of himself for the first time.